Good evening and welcome everyone to our webinar. Tonight's subject is tackling the affordable housing crisis. Affordable housing is an issue all around the country. Here on the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, my hometown of Anchorage, Alaska, we all have huge problems with providing enough housing for our citizens. And I hope tonight we'll be able to bring some clarity and insight to this very important topic and talk about how a national infrastructure bank is a tool, a very important tool that can be used to address this problem. My name is Julie Olson. I'm the chair of the Progressive Caucus for the Alaska Democrats and a small business owner, and I'll be the moderator of your panel this evening. We have some very exciting news to share with you. First of all, we've just signed up our 47th member of Congress as a co-sponsor for our legislation, HR 4052. So we're thrilled to have another congressperson from California, Kevin Mullen, who has agreed to sign on, making him that very important 47th co-sponsor. And even more, just today, the New York City Council passed a resolution supporting the National Infrastructure Bank. So New York City joins other cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and other large and small cities around the country that are supporting passage of this very important legislation. Also, Kansas City, Missouri, the largest city in Missouri, has passed a resolution supporting the National Infrastructure Bank. So even in this holiday week, our organization is working hard to develop support around the country to further this very important legislation. And we're thrilled to be able to share this news with you tonight. So with that, we're going to move to our lineup of speakers. We have an illustrious list here tonight, and I've just been informed that Delegate She from Montgomery County, Maryland will not be able to be with us. We sincerely hope she'll be able to join another one of our Zoom calls. She's a wonderful advocate for the National Infrastructure Bank and investing in America. But with that, we will go to Alphecca Muttardy, who formerly was an economist with the International Monetary Fund and is now the chief economist for the National Infrastructure Bank Coalition. Alphecca, take it away.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everybody to talk about this really important topic of affordable housing in the United States. I'm going to give you the the big macroeconomic overview to set up this evening's discussion, but I won't take up too much time because we have a lot of great speakers on board. First of all, we have a long-term housing crisis. The problem is that we're not building enough housing. Meanwhile, the price of housing is skyrocketing while most workers' wages are not keeping up. This is a picture of what our housing, the prices, the Case-Shiller price index for existing homes looks like. You can see the big spike in 2006 when there was a housing bubble, and you can see the price spike after the COVID pandemic broke out, and neither one of them has been kept up with wages, which are just kind of rising slowly and only had a little bit of a bump because of the tightening labor market. The problem is even more severe in the rental market. Here's a map of the United States from Harvard University showing areas where the cost of housing exceeds 50% of average household income. A big problem in Southern California and nearby states, all along the Gulf Coast, up along the Northeast Corridor. But surprisingly, those are all areas in red. Areas in orange also have a housing problem where housing is more than 30% of the average median income. So renters are hit hardest by this more than anybody else. The problem is we've had a housing price surge. Private capital markets are not building enough new homes. Wages have not kept up. It affected the election. Our housing shortage is anywhere between 4 million and 7 million units. Most of the renters are priced out. So are low income families or young families priced out from home ownership. The National Housing Coalition, and we're going to have a great speaker this evening, says that we need 7.3 million new affordable units or subsidies to make them affordable for renters. There's a budget constraint, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and state and local budgets are not picking up the difference here because they mostly pass on federal money and don't have any budgeted money of their own for affordable housing. The basic problem is the federal budget can't keep up with this either. They haven't got an adequate supply of grant money in the budget to subsidize affordable housing. This is what they currently spend and $39 billion they spent in 2013, 60 billion in 2023, but all spending went up over that period. So if you look at housing assistance in the budget as a percent of what we spend, total discretionary budget, it's been only 4% of total spending over the last 10 years. Has not increased. Most of that goes for Section 8 housing, which is a program to provide money for the difference between a market rental rate and what a family could afford. That's most of the money. There's some money in there for public housing that's owned by housing units that are owned either by the federal government or state governments. That's a much less amount of money. And then there's some low income housing tax credits for developers to build new affordable housing. But the problem there is that program sees as many units of housing going out as the developer has paid off the loan or 15 years expire, and he doesn't want to provide this low-income housing anymore, so it reverts back to the housing market. In 2023, as many units went out from the low-income housing tax credit as came in, new ones being financed. So altogether, the federal government spending for housing assistance has not kept up, and meanwhile, housing prices have escalated, and that's there's no chance of spending more from the national budget in the future because we're hugely in debt. Today, we had a big fiasco with trying to even have a continuing resolution for our budget, which failed on a second try of some other plan to, lift the debt ceiling altogether. So it looks like, barring anything happening tomorrow, as if there might be a government shutdown come tomorrow night at midnight. And that'll be a Christmas, lump of coal for a lot of people around the country. So we need to build much more affordable housing. We have a shortage, we have homelessness, we have the two factors that drive the crisis, which are flat incomes and rising prices, worse since COVID. How will the NIB provide funding for this? First of all, the $5 trillion the NIB will lend for infrastructure projects all across the country will create 25 million new great-paying, family-sustaining jobs. That'll make it easier for families to afford housing. And then, in addition, part of the spending projects will be $720 billion off budget over 10 years to build over 7 million new affordable housing units. We'll try and use a best practice social model to ensure that this housing stays publicly owned, that it doesn't revert back into the private sector. We'll build, we'll provide not only the financing for the construction, but we'll be lending to an entity like a housing authority that can provide the cross subsidies to complement rents and make sure that they're affordable for a very large portion of Americans that are below the poverty line. So, and then we want to, of course, build housing that connects to commuter rail, and all of this will improve property values and really provide new planning for urban areas or even rural ones. So that's what the National Infrastructure Bank will do. So with that,
Thank you, Alphecca.
I'll turn it over to the other speakers.
I neglected to mention that we are going to have a Q&A after we get through our very important speakers. And Alphecca has a lot of information and a lot to say about housing and the National Infrastructure Bank. So please write down your questions and let's make sure we're able to put them to our speakers and get some in-depth answers from them in the Q&A. Okay, we're going to move right on to our next speaker. We have with us economist and author, former managing director of Goldman Sachs, and a person who has testified as an expert in front of Congress, Dr. Nomi Prins. Nomi?
It's really interesting where we're at now also in terms of the lack of strategy and large funding that's going to be coming from Washington in its current state. There's still the ongoing squabble about the budget. We've got the debt ceiling looming, the date January 2nd. We passed what was the debt ceiling when it was suspended at $31.4 trillion. We're now at about $36 trillion in debt. And what does all that mean in terms of housing and in terms of affordability? Well, it means at the long end of the yield curve that basically mortgage rates, even if people wanted to buy homes, have remained high. The Federal Reserve policy since March 2022 through July 2023 of raising rates from basically 0% up to around 5%. Now they're around down at 4%. They have cut by 100 basis points this year. Still means that even if short rates are lower than they were at their more recent highs, the long end isn't moving. It's not moving because of debt. It's not moving because of uncertainty. It's not moving because other nations are not buying as much of our debt or as much of a portion of our debt as they have in the past. So the general demand isn't out there. And that in turn for housing means that mortgage rates have stayed very high. We just ticked up to 684 on the 30-year. And these rates are just exorbitant in terms of what people can actually afford. And even with that, if we look at the general affordability curve, there was a study out, again, echoing some of what Alphecca said with some other data by the Aspen Institute, which said the median homeowner in America today has a net worth, well, actually in 2022, last time all the data was available, has a net worth of $400,000. Those things might have risen since the stock market has basically risen over the last year and a half. And the median renter's net worth is $10,000. So that is 40 times less than the median net worth of the average American homeowner, which is way less than the vast sort of gap between the highest net worth homeowners and the lowest net worth homeowners anyway. And so those who want to buy first homes, they first of all have that issue with worth. They have the issue with rising prices as well as high mortgage rates. The median existing home price has risen for 16 months in a row. So the entire time effectively that the Fed's been mucking about with interest rates. And again, even though the Fed has cut rates, it hasn't impacted the long end of the curve for all those other reasons. So the general financials of home ownership continue to be getting worse. And that is outside of all the availability statistics that Alphecca was talking about, that Julie's talking about, that we all know about. And so banks themselves are not going to, Wall Street banks anyway, are just simply not going to make up this gap. And it's very unlikely that the House in its current structure, unless it passes a national infrastructure bank or some sort of external financing mechanism, is going to vote to give any sort of funding to this area at all. I mean, we saw the tweet that went out from Elon Musk about just really passing the current budget in its form and the negation of it by Trump. These are the kinds of things that we're gonna that we've seen like today, and that we may continue to see in terms of what could come out of Washington if these processes of financing things like housing are left to Congress and the executive branch. What can be left to Congress and possibly the executive branch is supporting and funding, supporting a funding mechanism like the National Infrastructure Bank that allows the debt that is hanging over the long end of the curve in the country in terms of interest payments being high with rates being where they are, to really be abated. And what's interesting to me today is despite the fact that there's been all this sort of negation of the current House proposal for the budget is that President Trump basically said we're going to lift the debt ceiling. What does that mean? That means that the United States will continue to increase debt in the long end of the curve. That's going to continue to weigh on interest rates in the mortgage market, and that's going to continue to have a negative impact on what the United States needs to fund for itself in interest rate payments alone in order to wrestle with the deficit and everything else. So the situation that is bad enough in the housing market is continuing to get worse in the funding market and arena for the United States government as a whole. And so this really is the best time to collaborate across the aisle with Democrats. 47 is a fantastic number who signed on to this bill, and Republicans, because everything that we've been talking about in terms of debt, in terms of lack of funding, in terms of these infrastructure and housing and other related problems that are occurring in the United States cannot simply be solved every day more and more unless we have an external mechanism to come in as a solution that's off budget, that's off balance sheet, and that is basically no new taxes, no new debt, as this is.
Thank you, Nomi. Really appreciate that, although that was kind of a bleak picture that you painted. And the good news, however, is we believe we have a solution and a great tool that can be used to start addressing some of these systemic issues. Okay, so next, we are very fortunate to have with us tonight the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Field Organizing from the National Low Income Housing Coalition out of Washington, D.C. Please welcome Sarah Sadian. I hope I pronounced that right, Sarah.
That's close enough. Thank you. It's nice to meet all of you. It's nice to be here with you. With the National Low Income Housing Coalition, we focus on housing for people with the very lowest incomes. And we do that because all of our data and research shows that they're most impacted by the housing crisis and they're most in need of solutions. And what I'm here today to do is to share with you a little bit about what's the underlying causes of this housing crisis so that that can help shape, as you're thinking about an infrastructure bank, how can that shape what the solutions look like? So I'm going to share my slides, if I can. So let me know if you can see my screen. Actually, I'll put it in a slideshow. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing to know is that there are two primary causes of the housing crisis. One is that incomes aren't keeping up with housing costs. But today I'm really going to just talk about housing supply issues because that's what could be addressed by an infrastructure bank. And what we find is that there's a shortage of 7.3 million homes affordable and available to households with the lowest incomes. So one way of looking at this is to show how many units are affordable and available in the marketplace by income group. And what we see is that there are only 34 homes for every 100 extremely low income households. It's very clear that's where the shortage is the greatest. We see that in every state and every congressional district. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense too, that the people with the lowest incomes are the ones who are hardest served by the private market. But what's interesting here is that as you go up the income spectrum, let's say you're looking at everyone between 0 and 100% of area median income, you see that there are 98 homes for every 100 of those households. That's a cumulative number. So what that tells us is that the shortage is really driven at the lowest end of the marketplace, and that even though there might be roughly an adequate supply of housing at 100% of AMI, it obscures the fact that there's so much of a shortage at the low end. So this is the same data that we break out. And here we're comparing in solid colors the number of households and in stripes the number of units of housing that's affordable and available to the people in the same income group. So I'm going to start all the way to the left. We see there's 11 million households, but only 3.7 million homes. So that gives us a shortage of about 7.3 million units of housing. When you go to the next income groups, we're going to move up the chain to red. We're adding another 6.9 million households and 6.2 million homes. So there's still a shortage, but now it's mostly a shortage for that income group of about 700,000 units. Cumulatively, you see an 8 million shortage or so. But something very interesting happens by the time that you get up to 80% of AMI. So these are the folks in green. You're adding 9.4 million households and 14.5 million homes. So what does that tell us? That tells us something really important, that the private sector does a very good job of building and providing housing for people whose incomes are about 80% of AMI and above, but that even while there's a cumulative shortage at that level, it's really entirely coming from the lower end of the income spectrum. This is the same data, but we broke it out in a way where I think it's easier for people to understand. In yellow, you can see that's where the shortage of housing is coming from. In blue, that's where a surplus of housing is coming from. Of course, this has huge impacts on what people have to spend for housing. And you can see that 74% of extremely low-income households are paying at least half of their income on rent or are severely cost burdened. And those cost burdens go down as your incomes go up. That makes a lot of sense too. But it's helpful for us to understand sort of what are the immediate causes of those cost burdens, and they're different depending on the income level that you're at. And this is everybody who's paying at least half of their income on rent. You can see the vast majority are people who are earning below 50% of area median income. 69% are extremely low income, 21% are very low income. What's interesting to me about this chart is that there's a lot of attention from politicians and the media around middle income housing. Sometimes they use a term workforce housing, but really that's just 1% of everybody who's paying half of their income on rent, but they get a lot of attention from policymakers. The challenges that we see about the shortage of housing are happening in every state. There is no state where there's an adequate supply of housing for people with the lowest incomes. It ranges from the worst case scenario, which is Nevada, where there's only 14 homes for every 100 extremely low-income households. The best scenario is South Dakota, 57 homes for every 100. So still, half of the population in South Dakota who are extremely low income don't have affordable housing options for them. And this just shows that the people who are impacted the most are disproportionately people of color. Sometimes we get people want to know, well, what's happening in my community? My community is different than what's happening at the national level. So I pulled out an example from Los Angeles, which has, arguably one of the worst housing markets in the country, with the worst housing challenges. But what's interesting here is that you see the same trends, right? At the very lowest end of the income spectrum, you see the greatest shortage. You see a pretty deep shortage still when you're talking about the folks in red who are very low income. But even in LA, even though there's a shortage that's impacting lots of people, by the time you look at units that are serving people at 80% of AMI, you're still seeing the private sector provide enough housing for people in that income group. Even though cumulatively there's a shortage, it's nearly entirely coming in from the lower end of the income spectrum. And this is the same data from LA, but in red and blue this time. So our organization, like I mentioned, works on solutions to the housing crisis. And we launched a National House campaign in 2021 to focus on what we saw as being the large-scale systemic changes that are needed to address the housing crisis. And we think that there really needs to be 4 major solutions. One is bridging the gap between incomes and housing costs. We usually talk about that in terms of rental assistance or universal rental assistance, increasing wages, all of those things. The second is about building more affordable housing, particularly housing that addresses the market failure that I talked about a little bit earlier. Third is focusing on prevention tools to prevent homelessness, to prevent evictions, and lastly, around renter protections. But I'm only going to dig into the one on housing supply since that's what you guys are talking about today. So we recommend a number of things to help increase housing supply. The first and probably the easiest is to encourage more states and localities to reduce zoning and land use barriers that prevent any housing from being built, let alone affordable housing. We saw earlier on all of those charts that the private sector does a good job of building those market rate units, but we need to make it even easier for them to build. And especially that will serve people who have relatively higher incomes. But even if we were to do all of that, even if we had very lax zoning and land use regulations, you would still have the shortage at the very low end of the market. And that's because developers can't build and operate housing at that price point, or they would go out of business. The amount of money they would take in for rent wouldn't be enough to keep their property open and operated. So we have to see investments to build homes, especially homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. And we tend to focus on things like preserving the public housing that we have, building new homes through the National Housing Trust Fund, and reforming existing programs that put money into affordable housing, but maybe those programs could be better targeted. So when we think about social housing, when I was approached to talk to you guys about an infrastructure bank, a lot of it sounded like social housing, which is another issue folks ask us to often comment on. So the same, I think, rules here apply. Social housing could be a really helpful tool, or an infrastructure bank could be a really helpful tool, but it's important that we're targeting any resources, any subsidies that are associated with an infrastructure bank to building those units that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. Otherwise, we're just supplanting what the private sector can already build. We're diverting resources away from where it's needed the most, and we're creating yet another inequitable housing market that isn't really addressing the underlying causes of the crisis. So my recommendation of what I think you guys should consider with your infrastructure bank is making sure that it's able to combine both conventional loans for market rate units and subsidies for more deeply affordable units, even if it's in the same property. Two, that the bank needs to be able to provide operating subsidies. So there's development subsidies that build the construction, but you still need operating subsidies to make units affordable on a daily basis, and that make sure people can afford their rent. And you need to set aside units for the poorest households. I'm going to skip the conversation about the other solutions that we work on, but just to point out that this is sort of one pillar of what we see is needed. And I'll stop there so that we can continue with today's presentation.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great, and really appreciate sharing that information. I did put in the chat your website so that folks can go to your website and check it out. I do want to say they have a great series of charts that will actually look at housing needs by state and really kind of talk about some of the programs in each state. So y'all might want to take a look at that. So now we are going to go to California. We have with us Assemblyman Alex Lee, who represents the 24th California Assembly District. He is the sponsor of AB 11, the Social Housing Act, and among the areas he represents is San Jose, which I believe is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. So, Assemblyman Lee?
Yeah, well, thank you, Julie, so much. Alphecca, I think you have my slides, but I just want to thank you for doing that for me. And so thank you, everyone, for allowing me to be on the call just beyond this part, but you really teed it up, all the themes kind of very purposely, deliberately, so good job there. I really appreciate that. My name is Alex Lee. I'm the California State Assembly member for basically the Silicon Valley part of California. And we consistently rank about number 1 or number 2 of the most expensive metropolitan areas to live in the whole world. So it is really, really bad. Just to give you a sense, in my own zip code, the average single family home price right now is $1.633 million. And it's not that great. Okay, so let's go first to the first slide, please. So as you heard, I have been authoring social housing legislation in California. We previously did several efforts. but I just want to level set with you all on why it is important in the concept of the National Infrastructure Bank is that of the many things that the NIB can do is to also fund the great human infrastructure of housing, which has been a bedrock of success for so many, well, for everyone really, but has been a bedrock success and a deliberate strategy of our European and Asian counterparts. And social housing, just so if you don't know, it is state or government driven housing where they are in the driver's seat of development and is meant to be as a universal right for everyone. So think about your local library or public schools. No matter how rich, no matter how poor, no matter how athletic, no matter how nerdy you are allowed to go to public school. And that has always been the approach of our peers across the world. And we have not done the same thing when it comes to our housing programs, where we have with a mindset of scarcity and rationing. So it's really about making sure it's a program that's accessible for everyone, with the maximum benefit to everyone as well. And right now, unfortunately, housing is not treated that way, and social housing is a great vehicle to do so. And I will explain why. Next slide, please. So I just want to point out the 5 kind of ingredients of the social housing policy, which can be replicated and is being replicated at the federal, state, and even local municipal level everywhere. You need to combine these 5 aspects in policy to really get to a true operating social housing policy. And that's, of course, you need to have financing. You need to have your own in-house public developer expertise, which is crucial. You need to, of course, allow for the residents, the renters, or the owners living in social housing to have a meaningful say in how construction of community goes. You need to also have ability to bank land or assemble land together. But you, of course, also need the philosophy to ensure that it is the government's role to ensure that everyone has a home. That's really important. And so in the following examples, next slide, please, I'll give you some big picture aspiration kind of examples. I can go to the next slide, please, Alphecca. So there are 2 big gold standards of social housing. These are not the only examples in the world, but these are held up as the greatest examples. Is number 1 is a European gold standard, which is Vienna in Austria. Austria itself is barely has the GDP of my home county, so it's still, but it still is a very big place, and they have had their social housing program for over 100 years. Following the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, their society was quite in a state of rough transition. Vienna today has about 2 million people living in it, and 62% of all the residents live in social housing. And these are not undesirable places. It is norm, it is customary, and a lot of people enjoy living in them. Some of the pictures I'm showing you are social housing developments, although this picture in Alt Urla is not typical of all the buildings if you go to Vienna. It's more of the 80s kind of different structure setting. But anyways, so in Vienna, 62% of all residents live in social housing, but 75% of residents qualify. Basically, how it works in the Viennese system is that basically, if you're not above a certain income threshold, you can apply and get some housing units. These are, of course, not owned in the same way we think of it as a homeowner, although people can basically live there and rent there as long as they pay the rent. Their leases, if you will say, are indefinite, meaning once you sign up, it's yours forever as long as you pay the rent. You also have the ability to pass it on to your heirs and the ability to change the structure if necessary. But to really highlight their origins of this policy is that the post-World War I situation was that in Vienna, the old imperial capital, the homelessness rate was almost 1 in 4, and so bad that people were renting beds from one another. So it's like, I take the AM shift, you take the PM shift, and it was so severe. But they were able to deliberately cobble together many social programs, social housing, and so today they still stand as a really strong testament to the social housing success. And I believe in the last 3 years, the Economist and Forbes have continued to rank Vienna as the most livable city in the world, in fact. And compared to their peers in Europe, in other metropolitan areas, the rents in general are much more competitive and lower. And that's also thankfully because of a very active social housing sector, which because of actual market competition has suppressed the rents in the private sector. All right, now we're going to go to the second example. All right, so social housing in Singapore. Now, while Vienna and Austria are known to be a quite left-wing government, Singapore is actually very well known to be a right-wing government. They consistently rank on I think the World Economic Freedom Index as #1 friendly for businesses. If you look at their social policies, from a Western country standpoint, they would probably rank quite conservative as well. But they have also embraced social housing as a great means of urban and economic development. Singapore, just so you know, was decolonized in the 1960s. They are a city nation, around 5 million people, I believe, and they have been a country since about the 60s. And even then, they now have accomplished 1.2 million homes across their city nation. 80% of Singaporeans live in social housing. And basically, if you don't live in social housing, you are a millionaire. And there are actually a lot of millionaires and rich people in Singapore. But 9 in 10, uniquely, 9 in 10 of the people that live in social housing are home owners. This is a example. They're not the only example in the world where social housing residents are home owners. They own them the same way that people in America own their condos. You might not own the entire tower or building, but you own the tower. I'm sorry, you own the condo, you own the flat, in which you can pass on to your heirs, sell on a very limited market. And just so you know, the market itself is not the market that we know. There are no private equity firms. There are no investors. It's just other qualified buyers, persons who can buy on this market. And so you can also appreciate your asset that way with social housing. But they also run a very successful model. And both examples, the Viennese and the Singaporeans, share those 5 ingredients, and they take a lot of inspiration, or I take a lot of inspiration for those for my legislation here in California. So next slide, please. Also know that I usually do like a hour-long talk on social housing that I give across the state, but this is my vastly abridged version of it, so I'm going quite fast. But there are other examples of social housing currently efforts across the country. Most notably, next slide, please. Most notably right now is Montgomery County, which I think you're going to hear about with the Housing Opportunity Commission, which produced the laureate. Produced the laureate with the same principles, and they're held up as a very strong standard for American social housing right now. Seattle also passed by ballot in February 2023, their social housing developer, with language influenced by my previous bills. And in California, we have similar models where not called social housing and not completely under the umbrella, but they combine a lot of powers of land banking and financing to create affordable housing across California. And next slide, please. And so it brings me to the legislation that brings me to social housing as a picture, and why I'm doing it so much in California is because even in what I call the modern era of California, maybe nationally when it comes to more attention to housing and our reforms, where we streamline and do more, we still are vastly underbuilding to get to our goals. Annually, and the number's a little off right now, and honestly, the numbers might be worse annually right now, given the high interest rates. We are severely underbuilding for the need we have in California. So to really help fill that gap, we need our own public developer that can build mixed income units across California. And a great model of why social housing is so attractive financially, even to those from the political right wing, is that it's a self-sustaining model after you get that initial catalyst funding for the capital, is because you have a mixed income. You have people who come more fortunate in life and people who are less fortunate in life, and that's a direct cross subsidization. Some places call it solidarity rent. So basically you offset it. It's the same mechanism that is employed right now in the private side, which is called inclusionary housing, where you say we fight for 15% affordable housing at a private marketplace. So this, the rest of it is private rents, but it's the same mechanism to capture the same rents that otherwise would go to a private landlord or some private equity firm, but going back to the community. And that has been the mechanism of financing operationally and long term in all these other countries, is really having that cross subsidization. So it's really important to have that mix of income, because at the end of the day, when you have a catalyst funding for the operation, for the structures, then you can get there. And that's where a national infrastructure bank is so important. It's something we've talked about in California, getting our own infrastructure bank and public bank. We've not yet gotten that far, but it would be really important to do upfront, or to do loans and capital so that we can build these structures and then long time repay it off of the rents that are paid from the residents. Next slide, please. And I think this is the one that's about my bills. I think, oh, maybe not. So to recap, I have done a couple of social housing bills. The last one we did got all the way to the governor's desk to do a pilot on it, but unfortunately it was vetoed. Longer story for another day. But I'm also chair of the social housing select committee, as well as the chair of the progressive caucus. And it's really important that when we look for capital streams, is that when we're investing in social housing, it's seen as universal good, because at the end of the day, the mix of the incomes really makes sure that this is a solvent model for longevity's sake. And all the revenues made are really making sure that it's sustainable in the long run. And that's why it's really important. So that's my very quick and abridged version of a social housing talk. You can find out more on the last slide. You can find out more if you can go to the last slide, please. If you can find out more and contact my office here. We also have social housing or californiasocialhousing.org, and you can go to that website. But we're hoping to get it off to the finish line this year and get more financing done at the local level. We're really hoping that we can synergize our efforts at the national level. So thank you again. Really appreciate your time and your interest. And if you have other questions, please reach out. Thank you.
Wonderful. That was an extremely interesting presentation, and we're going to get right to the Q&A here in just a couple minutes. We do have one more speaker, and that would be one of our most stalwart supporters from New York State. She has worked very hard to raise the level of awareness of the infrastructure bank in New York, and I do believe she was at that, I think it's going to be infamous New York City hearing that happened today. And so I would like to introduce Assemblywoman Joanne Simon. Joanne?
Thank you very much. And thank you, Alphecca, for noticing I was here. It's okay. So yes, thank you. The hearing today was great, which for the rest of you is New York City Council passed a resolution in support of the National Infrastructure Bank. And we got through the Finance Committee, and it also passed the entire council today. So that is now done. So that's another organization, big organization, that is in support of the National Infrastructure Bank. So, today I wanted to just talk a little bit about sort of on the ground how this issue of affordability affects us. Assemblymember Lee from California has a social housing bill. One of my colleagues in New York has one as well. Assemblymember Lee, I don't know how long your bill is, but my colleague's is 29 pages long, so it's very detailed. In my experience, that means it can be a little tougher to pass. So we haven't passed it yet. It was introduced last year because there are so many details in it for people to ask questions about. But it's a very important piece. This is all one of the biggest challenges we have is we don't have enough federal money in housing. That's been true for decades. And because of that, we have not been building and not been supporting enough of truly affordable housing. And so while we have mandatory inclusionary housing here in New York City, that is for rental housing, if somebody is building housing, they have to, the maximum that would come in as a mandated inclusionary housing would be 25%. Depends on the mix. It could be as little as 20, hopefully 25. And that's about 60% of AMI. And the AMI in New York is quite high. And so in reality, that 60% of AMI is still pretty high. It's not available to a lot of people who really need truly affordable housing, which is why the social housing model has been very intriguing. But the reality is, if we had a national infrastructure bank, we'd be able to fund the building of truly affordable housing. We have a number of not-for-profit housing developers who can build more cheaply, more permanently affordable, and more deeply affordable. But they have a hard time accessing capital or accessing enough capital. And so while they exist and they would do a great job, we cannot get them enough capital. That capital is taken up by large private housing developers. And for the most part, they have a high profit margin, And they can really only afford to do a small number of housing. And so the challenge we find in districts like mine, where I don't really know what the average price for a house is in my district, but easily the houses, individual houses, which are mostly brownstones in my district, are going for $3-4 million. So that's a lot of money. You can get a co-op, you can get a condo cheaper, but we're also building a lot of studio apartments and a lot of one bedrooms because the developer can get many more units built. So we are increasing the number of units, but we're increasingly making it hard for people who have families to stay in New York. And that is an issue throughout the state, is particularly an issue in the city. So the reality is that we can find ways to make more of this housing. We haven't been able to do that because of this lack of access to capital, because the amounts that we're mandating for inclusionary housing are relatively low, and you're still building 75% that is market rate. And market rate in most of New York City is pretty darn high. You cannot buy a house in East New York, which is not a particularly wealthy community, for less than $1.6 million. So for me, this is really goes to this crying need we have for housing, but also affordability. And I don't know, can't speak to California, but the reason people are leaving New York for New Jersey, for example, is affordability, and they can get a 2-bedroom or a 3-bedroom. And so these are some of the issues we're grappling with, but we can do all of these things if we actually have a national infrastructure bank. That would just give us the capital to be able to do what it is we need to do that we haven't been able to do in so long. And so I will leave it there. Somebody did mention the low-income housing tax credit. In my district, one of the problems is it runs out, right? So once that tax credit runs out, then you have a property owner who is not interested in working it out with the tenants very often. And that's a real challenge once that low-income housing tax credit has run out, expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Really appreciate you being here. Now I'm gonna put someone on the spot. We have Senator Kaler from Illinois, I believe, is on the call this evening. Senator, did you want to take the opportunity to say a few words about housing in your area?
I'm amazed at listening to the stories about New York and California. So my wife and I bought a house about 13 years ago. It's in a historic district, overlooks the Illinois River. It's about 2,400 square feet. It's a 100-year-old house, Italianate in design. And it was $225,000. So the average price of a home here in Peoria is probably anywhere from $150,000 to $200,000, but we still have a housing shortage problem. And I was interested in Assemblyman Lee's discussion about their area and what they're doing with social housing. And a speaker before him, I don't remember her name, but showing the graphs of where the most severe shortage is. And it's at the lower income. We know that. So we know that cities all across the country and even here in Peoria, we have a problem with homelessness. And again, we have a lot of housing that's available in the middle class area and certainly in the wealthier areas. But we don't have either good housing or affordable housing at the lower end of the spectrum. And so we need to have, it's quite simple as to how we solve our housing crisis problem. We build houses. And so I think the National Infrastructure Bank is really a good long-term solution because it will supply the kind of capital that we need for whether it's social housing being built by governments or whether it's and it's probably not going to happen here in Illinois as much, but it's going to be more private developers that are doing that. Now we can combine that with some of the programs that we have through the Illinois Housing Development Authority, where they will fund the gap between what is able to be collected from conventional loans, and always there's that gap, making it a good risk for the developer. But still, they need access to that capital, and so I think that this is just a good strategy for a long-term solution of how we put money into the system. That's the key. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about roads and bridges, whether we're talking about building schools and hospitals, or whether we're talking about housing. The key of this is that we need the capital to invest in that. So I'm on board. I have been ever since we began this discussion, and I was involved in it. And I think this is just another excellent aspect of that.
Thank you, Senator. Really appreciate you being able to share with us your experience. Okay, now we want to remind everyone that our volunteer organization is working hard through the end of the year to get additional co-sponsors. And we're working in cities and states around the country to find more supporters. And we would like to develop an organization and interested folks in your state. So your Congress people are all going to be going home. Well, we hope they are for Christmas and the holidays. And it's a great opportunity to track them down and see if we can set up a Zoom call and talk to them about the benefits of creating a national infrastructure bank. Now, if you were to go to our website, you would find an action page. And on the action page is a flyer that you can download. So you don't need to remember all the specific details about a national infrastructure bank. You can go to our website at nibcoalition.com, download the flyer, and take that to your city council person, the mayor of your city, send it to your representative or your congressperson. And so we really appreciate all the folks working in states and cities around the country to develop support for creating a national infrastructure bank. I do want to remind everybody, again, this is a totally grassroots effort supported by our volunteers. And so if you see that red donate button there in the middle of the page, we rely on your donations to support our organization. Of course, it costs money to put on Zoom calls and pay for our office and go and lobby members of Congress in person, which our folks are doing on a regular basis. And so we really appreciate your support. And so if you are so inclined, if you could take your phone and click on that QR code there, it'll take you right to our donation page. And we're just trying to raise another $2,500 by the end of the year. So while you're doling out Christmas presents, and if you're so inclined, our organization would be eternally grateful for any donation you might be able to make. Okay, so with that, we are going to open Q&A. We've had some really wonderful speakers. We've been presented with some great ideas here this evening. Do we have any questions or comments? So please raise your hand or you can wave at me through your camera. And I would be happy to take some questions. And I see Don Siefkins has his hand up. Don, you're muted.
Let me unmute there. Well, Sarah, or Assemblyman Lee and Assemblywoman Simon, I really appreciate all your work on low-income housing. I live in San Leandro, just south of Oakland, just north of Assemblyman Lee's district. The question I have is, every time the mayor of San Francisco or Oakland, which are plagued with homelessness and homeless encampments still, they'd get the financing for it, but there's no place to put it because, like on Mayor Breed of San Francisco, I can't remember the exact details, but it was a parking lot not being used for anything except a little bit of parking down on the Embarcadero. And she did all the work to get the thing approved through the development committee or whatever that maze of bureaucracy is in San Francisco. But then all these rich people that live in the $1 million condos and the tall buildings next door, it all came down there and started protesting against it, and they could never get it built because there's so much negativity when it comes to low-income housing and where it actually goes. I wonder if you could make a few comments on that, any one of the three of you or Senator Kohler from Peoria, as to how to help overcome this resistance to actually building low-income housing, which doesn't seem to exist in Austria or in Singapore. Those two very interesting examples, but our more higher income people don't seem to ever want to have low-income housing next to them. That's my question. What can we do to help overcome that?
That's a great question. NIMBYism is what we call it. We see that in a lot of places. It's not just in California, though. I will say it is particularly bad in California, and oftentimes those same homeowners or neighbors who are pushing back against low-income housing from being built are the same ones who are pushing for really restrictive zoning and land use restrictions that prevent housing from being built, not just low-income housing from being built. And I think that leads to, believe it or not, leads to more frustration from the public. I know that, everybody is looking at, well, why is the housing crisis so bad in California? Well, part of it's because of really bad state laws and they haven't fixed them. And part of it is because we misuse resources. So just for a good example here, if I could give you one message when it comes to your infrastructure bill, yes, we need capital and financing to go to the private sector so they can build more housing. Absolutely. But we have to be more careful about how we use subsidies to make sure we're building where the private sector can't build. And too often we misuse dollars, we shift it away. So one example I'll just point out, and this is only as a friendly comment, is the example that the state assembly member gave of Montgomery County. They call it social housing, but it's units that are only affordable to people who earn more than 60% of the area median income. None of the units are affordable to people with incomes below it, but it uses public land and better financing terms and lower rates, right? So if we're building social housing, but it's not building units for the poorest households, we're just recreating new models that are going to re-entrench the racial inequities that we have. We're going to continue to see homelessness on our streets. And then the public gets really mad because they feel like we're misusing dollars because they're not seeing an outcome for the tax money that they're spending. And so when you guys are designing your infrastructure bank, I think it's really important that you're layering in regular financing for market rate units and subsidies for the units that are below. Even if you have mixed income developments where you're serving lots of people at different income levels, we have to better use our resources, because otherwise, if we're using 100% subsidies for all, like social housing, some people have models out there where it's 100% subsidized, even at higher income points, it'll end up costing us 4 times as much to address the crisis because we're diverting money away from where it's needed. So that's just sort of my takeaway point.
I'd just like to ask a follow-up question here, and this I'd like to wrap in Assemblyman Lee. But when we're talking about Vienna, for example, those housing developments there include housing for extremely low-income residents, don't they? So those are mixed-use developments, and in the U.S., haven't some of these developments, extremely low-income developments, just gotten a bad name, like the projects? And people sort of remember the projects, or the hood from 30, 40 years ago, and they still have that idea in their mind that that's what extremely low income housing has to be like. And I feel like it's bad marketing in a way, or we have to try to overcome that. I don't know, comments from Assemblyman Lee?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is one of the stigmas in this country that public housing has a lot of stigmas too, right? I think we should not avoid that, and we have to learn from those mistakes. A large part of that is because the federal government stopped subsidizing, right? They really disinvested from these communities. But in a large way too, I always try to impart on people that work in the housing space and politics in America to think about a lot of the way we think about affordability is based on what's called, and this gets really in the weeds, but it's called area median income, AMI. So it says, we have X amount of houses for people with 30% AMI, 100% AMI over here. Just so you know, that is a completely American exceptional term. Like no one really in the world does housing this way. What they do is that, like in the Viennese model, they say everyone who makes up to, basically 110% of the average wage right here, you can qualify, period. That's it. And so you all get in there. And then just as a normal on the private market, and this is true for many of the different systems, is that based on how much income you have, your family size, all that stuff, you go and basically shop for the right unit for you, right? You get on the wait list and all this stuff. The wait list in Austria, when I visited them many times, they were very ashamed to say that the wait list right now is could be long as 3 months. So it's a long time for them to wait that long there to get a new apartment and everything. So I just want to reiterate that, yes, the mix of incomes is very, very important. And to also clarify that the laureate, as far as I am concerned, or as far as I know in the Housing Opportunity in Maryland, does actually have set aside for extremely low income at 30% level. They have a fixed rate. It's not colloquially as much as we want, but at the end of the day, it is capturing this. And I want to reiterate that, yes, while the mix of incomes may not be what we desire, because we would love to have all the people who are the lowest income society, lowest income ladders to have housing, the fact of the matter is the private market is soaking up all the middle class and all the rents, and they're using those monies to go buy up single family homes, which is happening in California as well, or price other people out. At the end of the day, what these other systems do in other countries is they accept everyone, right? By accepting everyone, you're soaking up that value that is not being pocketed by a landlord, private landlord, but by the government to reinvest in other things. Hence, they don't need direct subsidies as much. There are different programs out there, but they don't need to have an external cash flow constantly from their central government. And that's why the mix of incomes is so important. And I think it's important to stress and focus, just as many other countries are doing right now, on people who have very different circumstances, be it they're refugees, be it they are homeless. Those demand special attention and circumstances, which they do try to do as well. But we have to ensure that is a universal program first and foremost.
Thank you.
I'll just say, I would love to serve universally, and you can have developments with lots of different people of different incomes. It's really about being smart about what financing tools are you using to reach each household. But if you're spending subsidy dollars to build units at 100% of area median income, where I showed there is no shortage of units at that price point, that's $150,000 on average, or in California, maybe $1 million to build a unit now, that you could have used in a more targeted way. This is not about not serving everybody, and it's not about not having mixed income developments. It's about making sure we're not building higher units that aren't affordable to the people who actually need it. And we have to be really careful about the subsidies levels, because otherwise we're going to be seeing more, there's going to be more frustration as we take to build up towards a social housing where everyone has housing. If people are spending billions and billions of dollars in subsidies and not seeing a decrease of homelessness on their streets, they're not seeing their construction worker and their food worker and their health home aides and their nurses who can't afford housing because the units that you're building with social housing is still too expensive, right? That's not the outcome.
Yeah, but in the specific context of the National Infrastructure Bank, and sorry not to do too much back and forth here for the moderators, but in the concept that you're advocating for NIB is you are loaning money to a developer to produce housing. And in this case, it is a public sector developer. And in this case, the public sector developer is paying back your loan, then making it more fiscally solvent through a mix of incomes. We are not asking for a constant stream of external subsidy. And this is why it makes it much more strong.
That's your problem, because if you're just relying on cross subsidy, you'll never build the units that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes, because the amount, hear what you're saying, that some of it will cross subsidize, but there is a market failure at the low end. The amount of money that rent that those folks can pay isn't enough to operate the property. You have to think about operating subsidies inside an infrastructure bank that can also be deployed, or else you're only building units that are market rate and above, or maybe barely reaching into it. You have to think about both pieces.
So we're going to try to bring in some additional folks here on the call, and appreciate the back and forth. I do want to point out, and it's very important to remember, this is for publicly owned infrastructure. And so certainly the local communities are going to have that opportunity to say, we want 30% of those units for extremely low income, or 50%, or whatever the number is. But the local communities are going to have that opportunity to design their projects. And I think this is where your organization comes in, Sarah, in terms of educating those local politicians on the needs. But let's go to Mary McMinn, who has had her hand up. Mary, do you have a question or a comment?
Well, this might show my ignorance, but I was just wondering if the uniform commercial code in every state, Section 8 needs to be revised, and if these investments and loans will be subject to be taken by banks if they're not paid or whatever. Ellen Brown could probably speak to that much better than I could, but I'm working on it with people in my state.
Okay. What state are you from, Mary?
Washington State.
Okay. And so
South Dakota and some other states have already revised their uniform commercial code, so that doesn't happen to people. But the threat is they lose homes, lands, their retirement funds, things like that. And I'm just wondering if this kind of financing would be exempt from that happening to them.
Well, I mean, I'm going to go back to this is for publicly owned infrastructure,
Okay.
lending to public entities. And so, of course, we hope none of them go bankrupt because we need that payment stream to continue to fund a national infrastructure bank in perpetuity. But perhaps, Alphecca, you could address Mary's question in more detail.
Yeah, your question really links together what Alex has said and what Sarah has said on how we make sure that the entity that's borrowing from the National Infrastructure Bank, which will be a public housing entity, can be self-sustaining and stand on its own 2 feet. Right now, there are about 2,700 of these housing authorities across the country. Some of them are better off financially than others, but a basic premise is that we want to make sure that they have a plan to do the internal subsidies, to run the market rate rental units, to make sure that they have enough of a subsidy coming in to provide the difference between market rates and what a family can afford, so that we get a good 25% of the units being built that are going to the very extremely low income housing. And so the bank would look at this borrower, which is a public housing authority, to make sure that its books are financial. It has a good business plan for how it's going to, deliver these units and pay back the loan.
Okay, and so that money couldn't be used by banks to invest in other things. I mean,
the NIB lends for public
derivatives or anything like that.
No, that's precluded in the statute.
Okay.
We want to be lending for real infrastructure in 20 infrastructure categories, including affordable housing. And we want to make sure that we're building the real economy in America.
Well, and if states legislators don't look at this, you might have more homeless people.
Well, we don't need that. So
No,
thank you for your question, Mary. We're going to try to get through some of our other folks here who have their hands up. Jean Binder, do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, quick question for Assembly Member Simon, New York Assembly Member Simon. You mentioned that a colleague had a social housing bill. Which colleague is that? And is there a comparable bill in the New York State Senate?
Yes. The bill is Emily Gallagher has the bill in the Assembly. And I know there's a bill in the Senate. I can't remember who it is. I'd have to look it up. But there is a Senate sponsor. I'm a co-sponsor of that legislation. But they went to Vienna, in fact, and did a lot of research. There's a whole group of them that went to Vienna to study this issue last summer, the summer before. And so the bill is very much modeled after the Vienna model.
Okay, thank you. Let's go on to Rochelle Asher.
Well, actually, hi, Julie. This is the husband, Don, even though Rochelle is right here.
Okay.
But I have a kind of a two-part question. First of all, I know a lot about Singapore, and it's an interesting note in terms of their approach, because it goes back to the founder of Singapore, who was Lee Kuan Yew, who did have a kind of a mixed model, which was very much kind of free market, but he was very oriented in terms of improving the skills and creating social cohesion in a country when it was kind of decolonized, but they had a long-term plan, which was to build up the economy, provide an income stream for the population, and kind of unite the multiple parts of the ethnic segments of the country. Now, in the United States, we don't have anything like this in terms of long-term plan. And I think one of the unique things about the NIB, which people may comment on, is that, I mean, we can't look at the housing question separate from what Alphecca said at the beginning, which is how we're going to rebuild, how we can create jobs through the NIB. I mean, I go back to Baltimore, which I'm from, and they still don't have any mass transit between what have been the inner cities in the eastern and the western part of the city, which could access any areas of employment outside of the inner city. So we need the employment, some degrees of, manufacturing coming back, et cetera. But we also need to have this housing in areas where we're building the mass transit, which could enable people to get a living standard, which would enable that housing to be sustained in these neighborhoods to be, livable again. So I'm saying that as a kind of a challenge, because being out here in the ultimate suburbs in Loudoun County, Virginia, I see that some of these affordable housing plans, they're oriented towards, how you can make sure that the service workers who can't afford to live in this county have a place to stay so that they can work at, McDonald's, or even teachers and firemen who can't afford on their salaries to stay here. So we need to have a bigger view, and I think the NIB presents that possibility of uniting the total plan of improving industry, employment, and therefore things like transportation, along with building the housing, which I think is crucial. So this is something various people may want to comment on. Second question, which is also broad, which Nomi may have something to say about, which is the role of private equity. And I know this is not the NIB per se, but obviously I'm concerned that this is not being taken on because so much of Congress is owned by private equity, and their role, particularly around the rental market, as well as other related similar companies dealing with private housing. And well, I guess the third question would be to the person from the coalition on public housing is the question of renting versus owning, because to me, the percentage of renters versus owners is, I guess this is my intuitive guess, is not healthy in this country. And more people, there's a big advantage to having an economy in which you are encouraging more people to own in terms of the improvement of those neighborhoods. So that's a lot of questions rolled up in one. Thanks.
Okay, Nomi, do you want to weigh in on the equity question? You're muted. Uh-oh. While Nomi gets
Maybe
her audio
Alphecca can.
under control, we'll go to Alphecca.
Well, gee, John, I think you've asked the world there. I take your and I take your point that really this National Infrastructure Bank is about reformulating the American economy. The housing is one part of it, but we've got old infrastructure. We have dilapidated Rust Belt areas. We have places with housing crises. We have climate change problems. We have so much to work on in our real sector, and nothing has really been active in the private sector, in the money markets. They're busy chasing after yield and profits, and they're not interested in doing these kinds of investments. So that's why we need a public bank to do it, and we need to do it we need to have better planning to go along with our investments as well. Because as another speaker pointed out, we're not very good on doing development planning in the United States anymore. So all these things do fit together. And we really see that while you're right, it's important to promote home ownership. There's some funding in Congress to try and promote home ownership, but the crisis right now is in the rental sector. That's where the lowest income earners who can't anywhere near afford to buy a home are really desperate and on the brink of homelessness because their pay is flat and the housing prices and rental prices have increased. So as an emergency measure, the bank would probably focus on that first, lend to social housing authorities that can get up and running and overcome all of the impediments that we've seen in the housing market so far. And this bank will be targeting the lowest income families. That's for sure. So if Nomi, have you got your sound back on again? Not yet.
No. Okay, you know what? We're going to take another question because I do want to try to get to everybody. We have with us here Walt McRee. I believe Walt is currently the chair of the Public Banking Institute. And Walt, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, just a comment. This is such an enormously complex problem. And clearly it's not to be solved just by having the availability of finance. This is a tribal problem. The communities have different expectations and cultures and needs. And of course, the market impacts are complicated themselves. We've been living in a housing situation that's dominated by market interests and dynamics. And I think ultimately a large bestowal of money, much of which is going to be coming in from the IRA or from across the country soon, billions of dollars. It will always come down to how it's going to be implemented. So what I'm getting at here is that Sarah's points are really are key, I think, for really making some substantive improvements, that we focus on people who really can't afford to be anywhere close to the market. And that kind of a solution has to be derived and perhaps certainly negotiated, but also created collectively by people who are concerned about who these people are and the systemic disadvantages that prevent them from participating in market solutions. So the NIB, I think, is importantly is critical in moving the flow. But I, of course, am a protagonist for public banking, and I think that this is ultimately a local issue, and that publicly owned banks, the local publicly owned banks, are an important player in how we can have a conference and a coalition of problem solvers. Engineers, architects, builders, everyone is going to have to work together sensitively on what it takes for people to have homes in this economy, in our culture. So I know that's broad, but I think we don't want to try to think that we're going to solve this by just having money on the table.
Thank you, Walt. Appreciate those insights. Okay, Randy Bowler, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question or a comment?
Well, thank you, Julie. I have a couple comments. I've been involved during my time as a elected official, as a mayor in our community, a very fast-growing community in the Triangle. And we started addressing this issue of affordable housing, or I like to call it affordable living, in 2005. The challenge, we did a study, and we still need 2,000 units today that we needed in 2007. The challenge, obviously, is that local officials, regardless of political party, tend to kick the can on this and not necessarily want to make the tough decisions to deal with NIMBYs who generally are whiter and wealthier and don't want diverse groups of people moving in their community. Now, I'm also someone who's a real estate developer. I've developed green and affordable communities. I've done both sides of public-private, and I've been observing this for years. Mainly what you're talking about here at the National Infrastructure Bank, which I'm 100% in favor of, are just things that need to be addressed, Sarah and Alex, which I agree with. But in order to address them, we need to actually get control of the land, whether that land is controlled by the bank and then sold back into private hands, or an NGO or a public-private partnership. It's the land that drives the cost. I can do offline discussions with you about where we've gone with the ratio of a finished lot to actually a house and why this is driving the cost through the roof. The other strategies that would need to be evaluated are where we're going to go with our density and how we're going to build and where we want this density to be. Are we going to be on greenfield sites, Are we going to focus the money on rehab and how that money is allocated? And I'm happy to share privately I posted in the chat, I've interviewed on my radio show a number of people in this area who can talk about pretty eloquently about the tax credits, about other funding sources. But I will tell you, if you roll to the very end of the interview I put up there with Mark Shelburne, who's a national expert, I asked him point blank if he could wave a magic wand, what he would do. And to Alex's point and a few others, if he could control it, he said he would get rid of zoning impediments and go to a simpler zoning structure that would allow more freedom for the policymakers as well as the market forces to actually address this together. But getting there is incredibly difficult because people are highly resistant to giving up on that control for a variety of reasons. Anyway, I'll tap out, but I'd be happy to help and answer questions or provide data that I have from National Association of Realtors, from developers, from other experiences we've had in this market, the triangle market, where prices are kind of like San Jose, Alex, where it's getting out of control and we don't have any stock available in certain areas below 375. In fact, most of it is now getting above 750. 54% of my county market is there, which is insane because our county used to be viewed as the place where graduate students would go from Chapel Hill and go live cheaply, not have to try to buy a house at $750,000 to $1 million. But that's where we are in 2024. So thank you.
You're absolutely right when it comes to thinking about infrastructure. It can play an important role too, but I think we all know that there's going to take lots of different solutions to address this crisis. And zoning and land use reforms, you really can't overstate how destructive those rules have been in terms of preventing housing from being built. And something that I think people don't realize is that those rules came about starting in Jim Crow America after the Supreme Court found that, or after Congress passed laws that made it illegal to discriminate in the housing markets. Communities started turning to zoning and land use reforms as another way of trying to prevent people of color from moving into their communities. I don't think that's how a lot of people necessarily think about it now, but that's where it really stems from. And the end result has been that we can't build housing, prices continue to go up. And when you combine that with NIMBYism, right, it means that we're shutting out a lot of people from our neighborhoods who need to have equal access to our neighborhoods too. So I think the zoning piece is incredibly important too, and hopefully it can be something that you guys consider alongside your infrastructure bank.
Thank you, Sarah.
Can I make a comment? Because, I live in what is a historic district in Brooklyn, which when I moved there was literally by every attorney doing land use would refer to as a slum. But in the last 40 years, that has changed, right? And one of the challenges we have is we're running out of land. That's a big issue. We have lots of our borough, Brooklyn, has very low-rise housing, but also a lot of middle income, low to moderate income African-American families. And so it's much harder to do takings in areas like that. But we also have the YIMBYs. And I'm somebody that everybody says you're a NIMBY. We have a lot of lousy planning, which I think is part of the problem that has been raised, where the planning has been not very good. That they plan for commercial, and that's not the market. And the market is residential. So what happens is residential in a hodgepodge kind of way. That's not affordable at all. But the YIMBY group basically don't realize they're often tools, right? And they're all concerned about building affordable housing and increasing the racial balance, except for the fact they're supporting policies that often don't lead to that. But they're not sophisticated enough to realize that some of their activities are part of the problem in the long run. And so it's a very delicate balance, and it's also a challenge because a lot of people mean well, but they don't necessarily know what it is they don't know.
Thank you, Joanne. I think I read somewhere that this problem kind of started with Richard Nixon when he put a hold on federal funding of affordable housing back in 1974. Yes. So that's 50 years ago that this problem has been building, and it's going to take a while to make these kinds of changes. And again, I just want to reiterate, we believe a national infrastructure bank is one tool that we can use to start making some positive changes. Let's go to Jim Hanley in Arizona. Jim, you've got your hand up. Do you have a question or a comment?
Well, I have more, maybe a question and a comment. First, I want to commend the coalition for putting this together. I think this is extremely informative, and anybody who's involved or concerned about public housing, I wish that they will avail themselves maybe of the copy of this meeting. I want to point out that here I live in Tucson. It's a medium-sized metro city, and there's been quite a few initiatives by the local government to address this problem. One of them is to revise zoning and to make multifamily housing more easier to build in existing neighborhoods. They have incentives for infill construction, for instance, and they also have a new ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, that allows existing homeowners to build mother-in-law, I think they call them mother-in-law studio, efficiency apartments on existing residential, regular R2 zoned lots. We also have a developer here who bought a Holiday Inn, and I don't know what his tax, I'm sure that he got some kind of a tax write-off for buying this Holiday Inn and putting it, it's operated by the Gospel Rescue Mission here, which is it's of course, it's a nonprofit, very long and reputable history of serving the underserved community, people on the margins, and they've really constructed this this very vibrant community in this large Holiday Inn where they're using the restaurant for community meals, for instance. So there's been a lot of, I think that maybe what I'm saying is that we have metropolitan areas that are ready to have a source of capital, because that's the last piece. We don't have banks. We don't have the banks and the credit unions. In fact, I reflect upon this issue of developers and builders, that they don't want to build low-income housing. The profit margin is not there. But part of the reason why they're not being built is because the banks won't lend to very small builders. They're too risky. But if we had municipalities that had building plans that can go to the bank, they will be able to take those risks on smaller builders, even perhaps co-ops being spawned out of construction unions, that kind of thing. We also have in this 7 million target units, that a lot of this is rehab. We also know that it's not all new construction, and I think that for instance, there is probably a pretty large vacancy rate here in Tucson in multifamily housing, in apartment buildings. These apartments don't get rented because the rent levels are so high that there's no market, but the landlords will not. They will not begin to reduce these rents to make them more available to more lower income renters. So that's kind of thank you very much, and I'm really enjoying the program and so glad that that you put together such a good one tonight.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate your comments. Okay, we're getting to the end of our allotted time here, so I do want to go back to John Asher real quick. You've got your hand up again. Do you have a short question or comment? And if not, then
yeah, Julie, this is Rochelle Asher.
Rochelle,
we're sharing one computer. I had a question for probably Assemblyman Lee, but maybe Nomi or maybe anybody else who would know the answer. I was just curious in terms of the current housing crisis, how things have changed, say in the last 10 or 20 years, comparing incomes to this number of 30% of your income or more going to either rental or home ownership. Because, I mean, I just wonder what the difference is now compared to, say, what it was even 10 or 20 years ago. Not just in terms of home ownership, but in terms of the percentages of the population that are not, can never see themselves as being able to either afford or buy a house. And then I'm particularly thinking about young people today who, you know, so many, and I think it's a much newer phenomena of so many 20-year-olds and even 30-year-olds still living with their families because they can't possibly, with what they're making, buy a house or rent. So I don't know if Assemblyman Lee has looked at that shift in the dynamic.
Let's let our speakers take a stab at that. Sarah, help us out.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely getting worse. What you're seeing, rents have increased pretty dramatically, especially since the pandemic. Part of what's happening is a long-standing housing crisis, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, that President Reagan drastically cut HUD's budget in the 80s, and it's never recovered. So that's one problem that's happening. Two, we're not building enough housing, right? Those are long simmering problems. But then during the 2008 financial crisis, what we really saw that exploded things even more was a loss in construction labor. So a lot of people who were doing development lost their shirts in the process. They went on to go to do different jobs, and we just don't have enough people in the construction trades for like the last 10, 15 years, or since 2008. I can't do math, but since that time. So the housing crisis has gotten worse as we haven't been building in the last 10 years or so. And then coming out of the pandemic, what you saw was, again, another big growth in demand for housing. So what we call that new household formation. You see maybe people who were with other roommates and they're sick of their roommates. They've been living there during COVID and they want to get their own place. People who are living with a spouse and they break up, you know, right? All these different new demands for housing. And that's in large part why you started to see rents really dramatically rise after the pandemic. I'll say there's other factors there too. You do see landlords who were taking advantage of a really hot market, right? We saw rents go up by 40% in some places or 25% in different cities. So you just saw this explosion of the lack of affordability, and it's impacting lots of different people. So I think what you're seeing is actually very spot on. It's getting worse. Homelessness is at its highest rate that it's ever been on record. More people are facing eviction filings, which is why it's really important that we're taking a holistic view about the housing solutions that are needed and plugging in the right solutions for the right folks. So you're asking all the right questions, and I'm really impressed by everybody's deep knowledge on this phone call. And I'm glad that you guys are working on the infrastructure bank, and happy to provide some more feedback to Alphecca about some of the recommendations that I made earlier.
Thanks, Sarah. Assemblyman Lee, can you give your opinion on that question on new household formation?
Yeah, just very quickly, you know, you're speaking to one of the 5 legislators out of 120 who are renters in the entire state of California, even though about half of our population in the state of 40 million people roughly is, well, less now, is are renters. So, I mean, if you just looked at a graph basically over time, I'm sure is that wages are relatively stagnant and house prices have continued to skyrocket really without any bounds to them. And really, this is, you know, as Sarah was saying, this honestly is not a market failure. It's kind of market as designed right now. It's like, you know, we have made housing a real hot commodity, right? And so there is very little incentive, especially in California with a lot of our kind of crazy rules we have, where it's very little incentive to ever sell your fiefdom. In fact, it's more profitable to own more homes and rent them out and become, you know, little kingdoms everywhere in California. And so we have a really severe problem of homeownership being really out of reach, especially even for me, but out of reach for a lot of people. So I am one of those people that, you know, I haven't quite yet turned 30, but, you know, I don't think homeownership is in the cards right now unless we have a lot of cash. And so we are trying to do very much to spur that. And also why just in my talks about social housing, I put the Singaporean example about home ownership is I've come to find it's also an illustration that your program of social housing can adopt any flavor you want, really. Like it's totally optional, and many countries change how they look and feel, but the fundamentals are all there. It's also found that many Americans, of course, in their desires, if I ask them what they want a home ownership component of it. They want the long-term security, they want appreciation, they want those kind of things. And I do think it's important as we listen to people is like, how do we achieve those things, right? Whether maybe it's not the Singaporean condo style where you literally own your condo, maybe it's more in the security of a European style where you're a renter, but you have lifetime security. Because at the end of the day is we have to remember basically half the population are renters also enjoy very little security in over the roof of their head, whether it be arbitrary eviction or increases in rents. So as you see that chart grow and more, actually, I think the stat has grown quite significantly. I think it's 50% of Californians pay 20% or more in housing right now. And I think it's a similar, it's still a very large number of people paying for how much in housing costs, whether it be renting or in their mortgage and taxes and everything. It's a very, very severe rate right now in California.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. That kind of brings us to the end of our program for this evening. We've run out of time, but I do want to extend my heartfelt thanks to our speakers, to Sarah from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, State Assemblyman Lee. I do believe it's your congressman in California that just signed on as a co-sponsor. So we're really happy to have him as a supporter and really hope that we can get your support as well. As usual, Assemblywoman Simon, we really appreciate your efforts. Dr. Nomi Prins has been a great supporter, has accompanied our folks to Capitol Hill to lobby our Congress people. So we have such a great group here that's working so hard to advance this. And thank you all for your efforts. And please go to our website, nibcoalition.com. We are happy to have your help and support and would love to set up a Zoom call with your congressperson. Thanks, everyone, and good evening. Happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy holidays.